Hello, and welcome to AAJC's Connected Communities Digital Forum. My name is Alejandro Roark, and I'm the Executive Director for Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership. HTTP is a CEO roundtable of national Latino civil rights organizations working in partnership to promote equitable access, adoption, and the full utilization of technology and telecommunications resources by the Latino community across the United States. Before we begin, I want to invite everyone who is watching to join the conversation online by following @HTTPolicy on Twitter and using the hashtag HTTPinclusion. As the world continues to cope with the devastating social and economic fallout of the COVID-19 global health crisis, diverse communities are facing compounding barriers to accessing critical services, participating in online learning, and for many frontline workers, are forced to leave their homes every day and expose themselves to the risk of infection because of the lack of an at-home broadband connection, which allows them to live, to learn, and earn from the safety of their home. COVID-19, the presidential election, and the severe impacts of global warming has not only exposed the depths of our country's digital divide, but raised concerns about privacy, the spread of misinformation, and the tension between hate speech and free speech online. And most importantly, I think the continued lack of representation in media and the technology workforce. The 2020 election galvanized the largest multicultural majority of voters in American history, and with it, an important mandate to establish better systems and government policies that meet the needs of every American, regardless of their race, their age, gender, orientation, ability, country of origin, religion, or socioeconomic background. No other time is better suited to take bold action to address and redress the deeply embedded structural inequalities of the past than within the first 100 days of a new president's term. With little over 25 days into his presidency, Joe Biden has already taken decisive action to combat the spread of COVID-19, has recommitted to addressing the role the United States plays in the fight against climate change, has drafted the American Rescue Plan to provide economic relief to those most in need, and most importantly to our issues being discussed today, issued an executive order to advance racial equity and support for historically underserved communities throughout the federal government. Central to an effective economic recovery is the issue of how to best expand digital opportunity to every home. Broadband is the connective tissue that facilitates our ability to access telehealth services, for students and teachers to stay connected virtually, and for people to benefit from safety net programs and services, which have almost entirely shifted online. Our conversation today centers civil rights, equity, and accessibility, and aims to provide actionable recommendations to the Biden-Harris administration to create an inclusive digital economy that serves everyone. I am honored to be joined today by civil rights advocates, including Emily Chi, Assistant Director of Telecom Technology and Media for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Dr. Dominique, Director of Technology and Policy at the Joint Center, Maria Town, CEO of American Association of People with Disabilities, and Claudia Rees, Policy Analyst for UnidosUS. Thank you all for being here today. And Maria, I want to start with you because as a lifelong advocate for the rights and needs of people with disabilities, I'm hoping that you can provide some insight into the role that technology and telecommunications policy impacts the way that people with disabilities engage with the world and what types of actions the Biden-Harris administration can take to meet the needs of the disability community both today and into the future.
Certainly. Thank you, Alejandro. Technology presents incredible opportunities for people with disabilities. So much of the technology that we all use today was originally created for disabled people. Texting, originally created for deaf folks. Optical character recognition, the thing that enables predictive text, originally created for the blind community. And while technology has quite literally created opportunities and opened doors for the disability community, it also has reinforced existing barriers and created new disparities. And we have certainly seen that in the pandemic. People with disabilities, particularly multiply marginalized people with disabilities, have less access to connectivity to the internet. Not only that, technology itself is often inaccessible. Now, all of our public programs are becoming digital first. Many of these websites are not accessible to disabled people. And we are seeing that most acutely in the registration for COVID vaccines. State websites that are requiring people to sign up for vaccinations are inaccessible. Disabled people are spending hours and hours on phones trying to figure out how they can sign up for a vaccine that they most desperately need. And we've seen a lot of things happen in the space of telehealth. Before the pandemic, barely 10% of the US population managed their health via telehealth appointments. During the pandemic, telehealth has really exploded. And again, that's created opportunities to serve hard to reach populations, but we're also seeing, again, a disparate impact in the kind of care that disabled people can receive. And one thing that we would like to see from the Biden-Harris administration is preserving many of the telehealth related policies that CMS, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, have adopted, while at the same time not creating the idea that disabled people will only manage their healthcare through telehealth appointments. We want telehealth and in-person medical care to complement one another, but in order for that to happen, disabled people still need to get through the door of their doctor's offices. Healthcare providers still need to be culturally competent, and telehealth itself needs to be accessible.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that you raised a lot of really great concerns, and I know that there was a new paper that was recently released that I think kind of outlined the evolution of telemedicine from before the pandemic to now. If you'd like to hear more about that, please check out AAPD on their website. I know that they have that resource online, and please stay connected to Maria Town. So Dominique, the Joint Center has been raising consciousness for years on the important role that representational leadership plays in establishing inclusive policies by the federal government, or better said, how representation at all levels of government is the only way to achieve equitable outcomes for all Americans. Recently, you guys published a new report about the lack of representation in congressional offices and are calling for the Biden administration to appoint diverse leaders to key positions both in his cabinet, the FCC, and the FTC. Do you mind sharing some background with our audience about some of those prospects and who you think are well suited to help build back better systems to expand digital opportunity to everyone?
Yes, thank you so much, Alejandro. I'm Dr. Dominique Harrison, as Alejandro said, Director of Technology Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. We're known as America's Black think tank. And just to start off, we were founded in 1970 to support the newly elected Black officials who were moving in from civil rights activism into governance. And they needed a place that was doing research and policy analysis on how Black communities were being impacted by new legislation, and to understand some of the opportunities that policy can play in those communities. And so we became a hub for government officials and public intellectuals that are concerned about the future of African Americans. And we have a unique and great relationship with the Congressional Black Caucus today, who leans on us for our expertise and information with regard to these issues. And so I just started our new tech policy program, which is dedicated to exploring the impact of emerging technologies and developing the legislative strategies to improve the lives of Black people. We're focused on 3 priority areas. First is platform accountability. Second is broadband access and adoption. And third is privacy and algorithmic fairness, really examining the kind of the influence of privacy issues, the personal use of information, and how that can result in discriminatory outcomes based upon the kind of algorithms and data sets that are used. So when I think about the new administration with regards to diversity and inclusion, I think about a colleague. As you've mentioned, I think about a couple of things, excuse me. As you've mentioned, my colleague, Dr. LaShonda Brunson, runs our program on Hill diversity, has long argued for diverse representation on the Hill. But we also need diversity in specific agencies like the FCC and FTC to center the concerns of Black communities in the conversation. We know that policy is not race neutral, right? And when policy leaders do not examine pre-existing disparities, they're a risk of exacerbating them. Policy impacts specific communities in unique ways, right? Women, men, Black, brown, Asian. And so we need to be considering those issues. And we need members of Black, brown, Asian communities to be in leadership positions, leading these agencies to explore the benefits and costs of specific policies on our communities. And so we advocate for such folks like Commissioner Jeffrey Starks to be at the helm of the FCC to ensure that those issues are a priority. When I think about issues with regards to antitrust or platform accountability, we also need to think about the authority of the Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in examining civil rights issues to prevent discrimination. We need leaders of color in these agencies to be examining antitrust reform and how we can use our enforcement tools to ensure that markets are competitive and are beneficial to historically underrepresented and economically disadvantaged consumers rather than big business. We need to worry about the communities of color who are innovating and developing smaller business, but cannot get into the field because these big tech companies have a large monopoly over the system, right? Another issue is affordability of broadband services. That's one of the top reasons why Black and brown communities do not have access to home internet. And while research has shown that these communities say they don't need it as a reason for non-adoption, it may be in fact the way that the question is being asked of these communities, which is tied to cultural and social differences. And so I was actually talking to someone at the NTIA because I want to conduct some research around what affordability means for Black communities. And we were talking about how Black and brown communities have a high self-regard for their culture and families. And so when asked the question, why do you not adopt the internet? Instead of saying, I cannot afford it, we're gonna say we don't need it, right? Because we're not gonna say that we can't afford the internet. And so we need folks at these agencies to be examining these kinds of nuances, who understand the challenges and opportunity with regard to broadband issues. So we need FCC leaders of color, again, at the helm to be in charge of making decisions around affordability, pricing of broadband services, and how to reform internet subsidy programs to increase adoption of the technology. And so we have recommended 3 Black individuals to be in leadership positions at the FTC. And we hope the new administration takes this into account as they consider how to center racial equity throughout the administration and on the Hill.
Thank you, Dominique. I know that as I was just before I even got into tech and telecommunications policy and was working for just inclusion in general, right? Diversity and inclusion, I would always refer back to the research and the scholarship of the Joint Center, who has really been able to both quantify and qualify the impacts that lack of representation has in our day-to-day lives. So Claudia, we are fortunate to include your thoughts today in our conversation because I know that UnidosUS, for you guys, tech policy really is a civil rights issue. You rarely separate your tech policy recommendations from your core civil rights pillars, and as such, you ensure that technology and telecommunications policy is a central and integrated component of your national civil rights agenda. I'd love to hear more about your efforts at UnidosUS and how you frame your policy agenda through the prism of civil and human rights.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alejandro. So as you mentioned, I'm actually probably going to pick up a thread that Dr. Harrison just left off with, and that is, like you said, really centering the issue of racial equity in any sort of approach to civil rights policy, to begin with, but then on top of that to tech policy and really centering it as a civil rights issue. I am first and foremost a civil rights analyst, right? So for me, it's kind of bringing a different angle to tech policy, something that is not necessarily a space that I have always lived and played in. And I think that is actually just one of the really core issues that we're seeing right now in tech policy. To kind of back up a little bit, as you mentioned at the outset, 2020 really taught us a lot. Everything from the pandemic to the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the resulting movement for Black Lives, down all the way down to the election, and most recently the insurrection that happened on January 6th. And I think that the common sort of fault line that runs beneath each of these issues or sectors is the issue of racial inequality, systemic racial inequality, and the fact that structural racism has been embedded in so many of our pre-existing structures and policies and frameworks. And now the reality is that we're seeing that happen again, and it's only now becoming highlighted within tech policy and sort of the issues that Dr. Harrison highlighted, right? So everything from platform accountability to algorithmic justice, all the way down to affordable broadband access. And so when I'm thinking through this, whenever we advocate for specific policies, it always begins with centering the most marginalized communities whenever we talk about these discussions. And I think that in tech policy, it is extra crucial just because of how sort of far behind civil society really is on this issue. And so I think that, as Dr. Harrison said, there's always sort of the work that has to be done on the back end of contending with our history of structural racism, while also looking forward to making sure that these are not harms that are perpetuated, replicated, and exacerbated by new emerging issues like tech policy. I heard a wonderful quote the other day in an organizing meeting that really kind of, I think, captures this issue really well, which is, government doesn't know the difference between a server and a waiter, and developers don't know the difference between a bill and a check. And I think that sort of really gets at, this multi-layered issue when it comes to tech policy. And that's first of, a lot of the time it's government and lawmakers speaking a different language than what developers and product designers do and sort of tech wonks do on a daily basis. And I think therein is where we find the gaps that lead to these unintended consequences, like algorithmic, for example, hiring algorithms that weed out applicants of color. Like recently how the education department was revealed to have used automated systems in order to disproportionately audit Black and Brown financial aid applicants. Or if you even want to go to sort of surveillance technologies, the ways in which surveillance technologies have been, overused and deployed against communities, Black and Brown communities that have historically been over-surveilled by law enforcement already. Right, so it's really, what we're seeing is, kind of two lanes. And I think that from my point of view, from a civil rights angle, they need to be merged. And the best way that you can do that is to, as Dr. Harrison mentioned, make sure that you're bringing in diverse offices across agencies. And I don't think it just needs to end, and I don't think she meant that, but it doesn't start and end with the FCC or the FTC. We advocate for this idea of installing technology and data privacy offices across all federal agencies to make sure that the technology that they are using and deploying is done in a way that does not create more civil rights abuses, like the ones that I mentioned earlier. That also kind of, to take it one step further, the staff that is brought in also needs to be themselves diverse, right? To again, get the perspective and understanding of these multi-marginalized communities that have experienced civil harms abuses historically, and at different points throughout our history. Now, to get a little bit sort of more specific, again, tech policy, as everyone has mentioned, really runs the gambit, right? It's really from the beginning to something as new, from the beginning of like broadband access to something as sort of complicated and wonky as automated machine learning and the ways in which targeted ads work and those sort of things. And I kind of like to think of it as sort of like a Maslow's hierarchy, right? And at the very bottom of that pyramid really is affordable broadband access. There's an estimated as many as 77 million people in this country that lack, adequate home internet connection. And so that means that they either lack it altogether or that they only rely on sort of a mobile device or a mobile service. Now, within those 77 million people, about 26% of those identify as white, 35% of those identify as Black, 34% of those identify as Hispanic, and 41% of those identify as Indigenous. So again, we're replicating these racial fault lines upon which people are lacking access to what has become a most foundational and basic civil right. It really is the new frontier of connecting, like you said, to living, earning, and learning. And I think that, which by the way, I love that phrase, I'm gonna have to take that one. And so I think that that's something that's really important to keep in mind is that, just as much as we need to make sure that we're having adequate oversight and regulation of emerging technologies and developing technologies and the ways in which they're deployed, we also need to make sure that we are centering, again, the most marginalized communities who are still, lack adequate access altogether.
Yeah, no, thank you, Claudia. And first, I can't take credit for that. That was Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee at the Brookings Institution, which we love, who coined that phrase. That's where I got it. So got to give props where props are due. So no, thank you so much for sharing that. I think what we really have seen isn't the fact that civil rights protections don't exist in our country. It's that we haven't adequately enforced them as they have transitioned, as many aspects of our lives have transitioned to an online and virtual space. You know, one of the things that the Trump administration was successful at doing was using online platforms to broadcast misinformation, you know, both about the census and about voting, and most gravely, you know, to dehumanize communities of color, and using as a scapegoats to his, you know, in service of his unconstitutional attempt to consolidate presidential influence and prevent the peaceful transition of power. These actions, which have gone largely unchecked by Congress, the news media, and by online platforms, have led to real-world physical violence against Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities of color. Today specifically, we have seen a sharp spike in violence against the Asian community. So I wanted to really include, Emily, your perspective, and hopes that you wouldn't mind sharing what systemic forces you believe to be at play, and how the Biden administration can work to curb the rise of hate speech and white supremacy online.
Sure, thank you. And I want to thank my colleagues for bringing up the point that none of this is new. It's all grounded in systemic forces that have always been at play, harming communities of color and marginalized groups. Tech is not creating these new problems. Tech is simply amplifying and accelerating these problems that have always existed in our society. And like Claudia said, it's really important to center the experience of communities of color and the history behind the policies that have enabled tech to amplify these problems, right? So with the increase in incidents and harassment against Asian Americans, we know that none of this is new. There's a history of even just specific disease, false rhetoric against Asian Americans. We saw that with a bubonic plague outbreak in San Francisco. There was forced quarantine of Chinatown residents without any evidence that they were infected or responsible for any of the spread. In Honolulu, one Chinatown community was even burned to the ground in an effort to supposedly control the spread of disease, where they had no evidence that the disease had started there or that residents were even sick at all. So we know that none of this is new. And we really have to think about what are the words that are being used, what is the content that is being spread, and how is it actually no different from hundreds of years of our history. So when we talk about how the former president posted content about how Asian Americans were somehow responsible for this disease, how Muslim Americans were somehow a threat to the American people, those false lies and those dog whistles are not new. And so when we think about content moderation today, it's not enough to think about what are the words that explicitly incite violence or explicitly harm people, because we have no excuse. We have hundreds of years of history to indicate what type of rhetoric is going to incite violence. So we need to think about how have we progressed as a society and not progressed? What are the things that we still have to be careful of when we look at the content that is posted online, and what is going to become the most profusively spreading online. So that's one thing I want to highlight is the history. But like Claudia and Dr. Harrison mentioned, these issues are systemic, and we need to look at all tech policy issues from the lens of civil rights and communities of color. So another example that comes to mind is immigrant surveillance. We know that the history of surveillance in the US begins with plantations and monitoring individuals who are enslaved. We also know that with the creation of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese immigrants were the first in US history to be limited with their immigration abilities on the basis of race or ethnicity. So we have to think about that history when we think about modern day immigrant surveillance policies. We know that individuals are being tracked, that their social media is being surveilled, often without a permit. Sometimes they're required to wear tracking devices. Their biometric data is being collected at the border. We're using facial recognition, sometimes even on children. And we know that whatever happens at the border, when we use these technologies on the communities that are the most vulnerable, it's only a matter of time before we justify the use of it in our own policing within the US, on the poor, in our own communities. And so we need to be really thoughtful about what are the rules and the limits that we want to place on the use of these technologies to limit government power and protect the communities that we know are going to be the most disproportionately negatively impacted by this. And how do we prevent making privacy and security a right that only the wealthy, elite, and powerful can afford? Also thinking about things like going back to content moderation. Not only is it an issue of making sure that words and content that harm the most marginalized communities are being checked and taken down, it's also making sure that misinformation that targets our users in their languages is also being paid attention to. So it's not enough to simply translate content that might be in Chinese or Korean or Spanish. We have to really think about what is the history of these communities, what are the cultural barriers that exist, and how do we make sure that the messages that they're receiving that are designed to suppress them, to oppress them, are being adequately handled by the folks in power. That includes lawmakers and tech companies. So we want to look at everything through that lens of what's happened historically and what are the lived experiences of people of color today.
No, Emily, thank you so much for bringing up access to history, right? Because I think that, when we talk about representation, oftentimes we've said it so much and for so long that people kind of glaze over it. And I think to be explicit about the fact that, when you have a tech force that's predominantly white and male, they come with also very specific blind spots. And it's not that multicultural tech talent, it's not that we have some kind of magical ability to kind of understand or recognize injustice. It's just that our families have lived through these types of kind of recent American history and injustice. So we have that kind of familiar kind of like biological record that we carry with us, and I think are more in tune to the way that our communities have been impacted. And I think that we also know at this point in time that, the reason that some of our kind of white counterparts have these blind spots is because they haven't had, access through an accurate recording of American history. It's been kind of cherry picked and really kind of to just promote, I think, a more kind of a unified version or revisionist history of what we've all kind of lived through. So as we kind of get deeper into this conversation, I want to open up this next question to the entire panel. So today, if we were each to just pose one thing, one thing that the Biden-Harrison administration can do today or within the next 70 days to expand digital opportunity across the country or mitigate the harmful effects of unchecked hate speech and rhetoric online, what do you think that would be? And I'm happy to start with Maria. What are your thoughts? If there was this top thing at the top of your list, what is it?
Echoing what everyone has said, the thing at the top of our list is expanding access to affordable broadband. Right now, the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program restricts access based on household and not on the number of people who need it. They also restrict access on the kind of device that an individual can receive. Disabled people often need multiple devices just to access the most basic website, just to get connected. So we want to see broadband benefits made permanent. We want to see the amount of those benefits increased. We want to see the eligibility for that broadband expanded to the greatest extent possible. Anyone who is currently receiving federal support, whether that's through SNAP, WIC, SSI, SSDI, Medicaid, Medicare, should be automatically eligible for a broadband benefit. And the type of device should not be restrictive to what we think of as normative or standard tech.
Perfect. Dr. Harrison, what's the top of your list as you kind of think through these issues? Happy to kind of hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with what Maria is saying. That's the emergent, urgent issue right now, is that there are Black and Brown communities that don't have access to the internet. And particularly for students, young folks in lower income community, this is essential to succeeding in school right now, right? I mean, this can have long-term impacts with regards to, the kind of college they can get into, type of kind of educational attainment and job that they can obtain. And so we really need to be thinking hard about making some type of internet subsidy program long-term that really addresses the affordability question, right? So we know the Lifeline 995 subsidy program is just not adequate for today. It was developed 10 years ago, right? And even with the $50 subsidy, that still may not be enough. Broadband costs on average $70 a month. And when promotional prices are excluded, the cost jumps to around $83 a month. So that means families might be paying in excess $20 to $30 a month for internet service for a speed and that can accommodate the kind of needs that they have. But still, that may not be possible for families who are struggling in this moment. And so leaders, policymakers need to be thinking about coming together and seeing what is the cost that we need to think about so that families can afford broadband. At the same time, there's this discussion going on right now amongst Republicans to try to block municipal broadband networks in communities. And sometimes this is the option that is best for low-income Black and Brown communities because it's cheaper, right? And it provides a better speed and capacity for the kinds of things that we need to do online. So we also must be aware of what that conversation and ensure that they are not banning or limiting municipal broadband networks so that we can make sure, again, that we have the access that we need.
Yeah, I think today more than ever, we know that there is no one size fits all for every community. For some community, it's really addressing the issue of cost. For some community, it can be mitigated by bringing resources together and working with local municipalities to ensure that education is available in multi-languages and that there's an outreach mechanism to reach communities. And for some communities where there hasn't been rural communities where there hasn't been build out or landscapes where it's been cost prohibitive to extend that broadband infrastructure, we shouldn't be limiting the options that community has available to just to address the needs of their residents. So absolutely kind of echo that sentiment and understand that really, I think at this point, we need all the tools in our toolbox to be available to our communities. So Claudia, would love to hear, top of your civil rights agenda, what are you thinking through? What are you really kind of working with Congress and the FCC and the FTC to ensure that we are connecting as many people as possible?
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that Maria and Dr. Harrison led with that. It's kind of hard to double down, or I would say triple down any better than that. So what I might actually kind of pivot to is this idea of making sure that really emphasizing this need for tech offices and that meet at the intersection of civil rights or staffers and staff with civil rights backgrounds, right? I think it's really necessary as I think all of us sort of mentioned, to really make sure that we're centering civil rights in any of these discussions. And the only way to do that is to ensure that each of these agencies have the right kind of staff with the intersectional backgrounds that are needed to actually address this very issue, like you mentioned, of making sure that we're not developing a one-size-fits-all solution, of making sure that we're connecting with hard-to-reach communities to figure out what exactly are their very specific needs and what are the actual sustainable long-term policy solutions that can keep them connected. Right. And it's not just during this pandemic, right? As everybody I'm sure is tired of saying, we are in the new normal. We will be online for a very long time. And even if we transition back to, in-person life, the reality is that a large chunk of our lives will remain online. And so I think that that's something that is very key to ensure that we have sustainable broadband access. Again, is really making sure that we have an agency staff that is knowledgeable in these sort of histories and the intersections that is necessary to keep these communities online.
I just wanted to jump in really quickly and add to what Claudia said, that there are a number of civil rights groups and advocates who have argued that there needs to be more allocation of funds to places like the FTC because they can't afford hiring more staff. And so we need to, again, think about how Congress can give more money to make sure that the right people are there to examine the current issues that are on the agenda. So.
Yeah. Or to allocate resources for the specific intent, right? To, as Biden said, evaluate the agency's culture and their policies to ensure that historically disenfranchised communities are not only at the table, but are considered, their needs are considered as we move hopefully forward into a more inclusive future that includes all of us. Emily, what's the top of your list? I know that you also lead the Asian Tech Table, which is similar to HTTP in that you convene a diverse intersection of national Asian communities to kind of discuss these tech issues. So we'd love to hear what's on the top of, or what's on your radar, and what are you really kind of hoping that the Biden administration takes up in these next kind of 70 days of their.
Sure. Broadband is definitely at the top of our list as well. I'll add to what folks have already said to mention that rural broadband does not necessarily just mean, white populations. We need to be thinking about access for tribal lands, for Pacific Islands, for Hawaii, for Alaska. Think about the people of color who are also living in rural areas and need the infrastructure. And also thinking about the urban areas that have historically been redlined, have been seen as unprofitable. And therefore, even when they're located in cities, you can be literally across the street or across a bridge and not have access to the infrastructure that is required to connect to broadband. So even if we fix the affordability piece, these folks are going to be left without internet service unless we also address the infrastructure problem. We also need to have better data on who the individuals and communities are who need these services. Right now, a lot of internet access surveys are only conducted in English, are sometimes only conducted online, which always makes me laugh a little bit with sadness. But how do we even figure out which communities are not being served? And sometimes we look at historical participation in programs like Lifeline as an indicator of who needs these services most. But we know that because outreach has been flawed, that programs aren't designed for the most disenfranchised, that's a problematic indicator. And so we need better information and understanding of the lived experiences of people and what their needs are. Another policy priority for us is pushing for a moratorium on facial recognition technologies. And this is for two reasons. First, we know that facial recognition technology is flawed. There are numerous studies that indicate that there is a bias against people of color and women. For example, within the Asian American community, we know that there have been tests conducted that might show that might say that an Asian American is closing their eyes and therefore the facial recognition software fails. So we know that there are a lot of problems in the building of this technology, but we also need to make sure that even if the technology were to be perfected, we set a clear set of rules and regulations around that use of it. And right now that just doesn't exist. So we need to pause on use of that technology and better understand both how the tech works, but also how government is going to use that data. Last, I'll add, we already talked a little bit about hate speech, harassment, and violent incidents, but with any type of reform around content moderation, around privacy legislation, we need to make sure that we include the experiences of people of color, non-English speaking communities, of historically disenfranchised groups, because even if we are to update, for example, privacy rights with wonderful things like an accessible, actually understandable privacy policy, an opt-out option, portability, whatever it is, none of that is useful to consumers on the ground if they don't actually understand their rights. So we need to make sure that whatever new protections are put in place are actually translatable, are actually being explained to people on the ground so that practically they are actually able to exercise their rights. And it's not just an opportunity for lawmakers and tech companies to say, we did our part, we improved privacy, without actual results.
No, thank you so much for that. And thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. I know that we are running close to our time, but I heard a couple of things that I really just want to reiterate for our audience. Number one is we need to ensure that we have a fully funded broadband mapping program run for the FCC so that we can clearly identify where the gaps in our broadband infrastructure is, and so that we can connect the people that have had long-term, have just been left out of economic opportunity because of their lack of a digital at-home connection. I think that it's important that as we both applaud, and I think it's such a great initiative to establish an emergency broadband benefit program that will be set up, I think, here in the next couple of weeks by the end of February, that program really expands its eligibility and the way that it's kind of implemented to ensure that we are reaching people that, again, have been left out historically. You know, our goal is to cast a wider net and include more people and expand the circle of digital opportunity regardless of where people live. So I think that, you know, the EBB really is top of mind for us. And I think, as Dr. Harrison said, it's really, really important to ensure that we have representation both in congressional staffs and the FCC staff and the FTC staff and in key leadership positions, people that understand through their kind of lived experience the unique and compounding layered barriers that our communities face to a digital connection, so that we can begin to build back better systems that actually meet the needs of our communities. And I think lastly, what Maria said is, you know, COVID-19 has really allowed us to expand the reach of so many great social safety net programs, including access to healthcare, right? Specifically telehealth. And it's important that we learn from kind of like the best practices, the guardrails and the framing and the exceptions that we created to ensure that people are able to access telehealth during the pandemic, that those become a permanent option for people that really were able to benefit from it through COVID-19 and who will continue to hopefully benefit after the pandemic. So thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Dr. Harrison, Maria, and Emily Chi for being here with us today. Thank you for your work in service of the needs of our community. And also a big thank you to everyone who is joining from home. Please make sure to follow our panelists on Twitter. And while you're there, please also follow HTTP Policy to be the first to hear about our upcoming conversations as a part of our Connected Communities digital forums. And so I think until we see each other again, please remember to tune into the conversation, to speak up, to speak out, and to stay connected, because the future needs our help. Until next time, see you then.